For 15 years, my parents left me to freeze in the dead of winter, telling me I was useless and dead to them. But when the logistics company I built from absolutely nothing hit $45 million, they suddenly remembered my name. My father crashed my biggest award ceremony, grabbed a microphone in front of 500 people, and loudly declared that he was my silent partner who funded my dream. I smiled, for the cameras leaned in close, and told him that if he wanted to claim my life, he should have started being a father 15 years ago. My name is Abigail Foster. I am 33 years old, and I am the founder and CEO of Harvest Root, a national organic food logistics company. But I was not born into boardrooms or wealth. 15 years ago, I was a teenage waitress working double shifts, just trying to survive. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of a decade and a half of relentless grinding. I was standing at a podium in a lavish Chicago ballroom, looking out at a sea of 500 industry elites, investors, and national press. The room was dripping in crystal chandeliers and imported flowers, humming with the quiet energy of serious money. I had just been handed the Entrepreneur of the Year award. The heavy glass trophy was in my hands, and the applause was deafening. I felt a surge of pure, hard-earned pride. And then the heavy oak double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. I watched from the stage as 3 people marched down the center aisle, moving with an arrogant, practiced entitlement that made my blood run instantly cold. It was my father, Thomas, my mother, Diane, and my younger sister, Chelsea. They were flanked by a hired photographer, snapping pictures with every step they took. My chest tightened so hard I could barely draw a breath. I had not seen or spoken to my family in 15 years. Not a birthday card, not a phone call, not a text message. They were not there when I graduated from college. They were not there when I opened my first tiny warehouse and slept on cardboard boxes because I could not afford a real apartment. They were ghosts, but here they were in the flesh. Thomas wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his silver hair styled to look distinguished and authoritative. Diane was draped in a dark emerald evening gown, waving to the confused crowd, as if she were royalty arriving at a charity gala. And Chelsea, the golden child, who never had to work a day in her life, wore a smug, radiant smile, dressed in a designer outfit that probably cost more than my first car. They walked straight past the security guards, who assumed they were VIP guests running late, and marched directly to my reserved table at the very front of the stage. Before I could even process what was happening, my father stepped up to the edge of the stage. He did not look up at me with love or pride. He looked at me like I was an asset he was ready to liquidate. He reached out and smoothly pulled a microphone right out of the hands of the master of ceremonies. The crowd quieted down, murmuring in confusion, assuming this was a planned part of the program. My father turned his back to me and faced the sea of reporters and investors. "Ladies and gentlemen," my father announced, his voice booming through the speakers with a warm, manufactured affection that made my stomach turn. "I am Thomas Foster Abigail's father. We wanted to surprise our little girl tonight." The crowd let out a collective sigh of appreciation. The press cameras flashed, blinding me in a strobe of white light. My father continued pacing the floor with absolute confidence. When Abigail first came to me with the idea for Harvest Root, I knew she had something special. As her silent partner, the man who funded her dream from day one, I could not be more proud to stand here and watch her succeed. I stood, frozen behind the podium. The heavy glass trophy in my hands felt like it weighed 100 pounds. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Silent partner. Funded her dream. The lies were so audacious, so publicly calculated, that for a split second I thought I was having a nightmare. My father had not given me a single dime. In fact, he had done the exact opposite. But in front of 500 people, under the glaring lights of the national press, he was staking a claim on my entire life's work. I looked down at my mother, Diane. She was dabbing the corners of her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the overwhelmed proud mother for the cameras. Chelsea was grinning, posing perfectly whenever a flash went off. They were hijacking my moment, trapping me in a public relations cage. If I screamed, if I called them liars, right there on stage, I would look like an unhinged, unstable CEO, throwing a tantrum in front of my most crucial investors. I would ruin my own company's reputation. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were counting on my professionalism to keep me quiet. They were banking on the fact that I would rather protect my brand than expose their fraud. So I did what a CEO does. I smiled. I kept my posture straight, my expression composed, and my eyes locked onto my father's smug face. The applause roared through the ballroom as my father turned back to me, opening his arms wide for an embrace. The photographer he brought rushed to the edge of the stage to capture the heartwarming family reunion. Every camera in the room was pointed directly at us. My mind was racing, tearing through survival strategies. 15 years ago, I would have broken down crying. I would have let them walk all over me to keep the peace. But the woman standing on that stage was not a scared teenage waitress anymore. I was a woman who built a $45 million empire from scratch, and I was not about to let the people who threw me away steal the keys to my kingdom. I could not cause a public spectacle. I caught the eye of my head of security standing near the stage stairs. A subtle slice of my hand across my throat was all it took. The microphone in my father's hand went dead mid-sentence. The feedback whined sharply, plunging the ballroom into a sudden and awkward silence. I stepped forward, hooking my arm tightly through his before he could tap the microphone to check it. I smiled brilliantly, for the hundreds of cameras still pointed our way, projecting the image of a thrilled and surprised daughter. I leaned in close to his ear, keeping my voice to a sharp whisper. "We are going backstage right now, or I will have you arrested for trespassing." He tried to resist, but my security team was already flanking us. My mother and sister followed close behind, their performative smiles glued to their faces until the heavy velvet curtains closed behind us. The air in the private green room was thick and silent, a stark contrast to the roaring applause on the other side of the stage. The moment we were away from the flashbulbs and the eyes of my investors, the charade ended. My father ripped his arm out of my grip. The warm and proud dad routine vanished completely, replaced by the cold and calculating man I remembered so vividly. He did not say a word at first. He just reached inside his tuxedo jacket, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and shoved it hard against my chest. I caught it before it hit the floor. "What is this?" I asked, my voice dangerously steady. My mother stepped forward, smoothing the front of her emerald gown with a look of absolute entitlement. "It is what you owe us, Abigail. Read it." I tore open the flap. Inside was a formal legal complaint filed in civil court. The bold text at the top jumped out at me. It was a demand for 50% equity in Harvest Road. I stared at the paper, the sheer audacity of it knocking the breath out of my lungs. 50%. Half of the empire I built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The legal jargon swam before my eyes, claiming that my success was somehow their doing. Chelsea scoffed from the corner, crossing her arms over her chest. "Do not look so shocked, Abby. Greg's real estate business has been slow all year. It is about time you shared the wealth. Family is supposed to help family. Family helps family." The hypocrisy of those words tasted like ash in my mouth. I looked at Chelsea, then at my parents, and suddenly I was not in a luxury ballroom anymore. I was 18 years old again, standing in the freezing kitchen of our old house. I had spent 2 grueling years working double shifts at a local diner, pouring every single dollar of my tips into a joint bank account my father insisted we use to build my college fund. I had saved $12,000. It was my ticket, out my tuition money, my entire future. Then one morning I went to the ATM to withdraw cash for my textbooks and saw a balance of 0. My parents had drained my account overnight. They took every penny to pay off a luxury sports car Chelsea had drunkenly wrecked simply to keep her precious record clean and avoid a lawsuit. When I confronted them, screaming and crying that they had stolen my future, my mother had sneered at me with the exact same look she wore right now. "You owe us for raising you," she had said. When I threatened to call the police on them for taking my money, my father did not apologize. He walked into my bedroom, dumped my meager belongings into 2 black garbage bags, and physically threw them out the front door into the snow. I stood freezing on the porch as he locked the deadbolt. "You are dead to us," he had yelled through the glass. "Do not ever call this house again." I remembered the biting cold of that December night, the way the snow soaked through my thin sneakers as I dragged those garbage bags down the driveway. I remembered the absolute terror of realizing the people who brought me into the world cared more about a smashed bumper than my survival. For 15 years, I honored his command. I slept in my car. I worked 3 jobs. I built a $45 million company from the frozen ground up without them. I snapped back to the present, looking at the 3 strangers standing in my green room demanding a payout. You have exactly 10 seconds to leave this building before I have you physically thrown out into the alley. I said, my voice low and devoid of any emotion. My father smirked, adjusting his cuffs with sickening arrogance. We will see you in court, Abigail. Have your lawyers call ours. They turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the quiet hum of the backstage area. My hands trembled as I looked down at the lawsuit again. I flipped to the second page, scanning the ridiculous claims, and then I stopped. Attached to the complaint was a photocopy of a contract. It acknowledged a $15,000 seed investment from Thomas Foster in exchange for a 50% ownership stake in any future corporate endeavors. At the bottom was my signature. It looked absolutely real, but that was not what made the blood freeze in my veins. It was the date printed next to my forged name. December 12th, 2009. The exact same week they stole my college savings and threw me out in the snow. They did not just want to steal my company. They had carefully planned a timeline that twisted their ultimate betrayal into a fabricated foundation for my business. They had weaponized my worst trauma against me. I stared at the forged date, the pieces of their trap clicking into place, and I knew this was no longer just a family dispute. This was war. The morning after the gala, I woke up to a ringing phone and a shattered reality. It was 6 o'clock, but my screen showed 47 missed calls and hundreds of frantic text messages. I pulled myself out of bed, my mind still reeling from the forged contract my father had shoved into my hands. I poured a cup of black coffee and opened my laptop. The nightmare was already front-page news on every major business blog and local media outlet in Chicago. The headlines were brutal and coordinated. Local CEO sued by family who funded her empire. Harvest Root founder accused of betraying silent partner father. My parents had not just filed a lawsuit. They had orchestrated a full-scale media blitz overnight. The timing was not a coincidence. It was a calculated assassination attempt on my life's work. Harvest Root was less than 3 weeks away from closing a highly sensitive $50 million national merger with a major organic grocery chain. This deal was supposed to put our logistics network into every major city in the country. It was the finish line I had bled for over the past decade. Now the acquiring company was staring at a scandalous legal battle over intellectual property and equity ownership. In the corporate world, scandal equals liability. And liability kills deals. My phone buzzed again in my hand. This time it was my chief operating officer, panic lacing his voice. He told me the investors were already gathering at the downtown headquarters. I had been summoned to an emergency board meeting. I walked into the glass-walled boardroom on the top floor of the Harvest Root building at exactly 8:30. The room overlooked the city I had conquered, but inside the air was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. 7 board members sat around the long mahogany table. These were conservative, old-school venture capitalists who cared about profit margins and brand safety above all else. They did not look at me with the respect I had earned as their chief executive. They looked at me like I was a sudden, massive liability. William, our lead investor and the chairman of the board, sat at the head of the table, with his hands folded tightly. He did not offer a greeting. He simply slid a printed copy of a financial news article across the polished wood. The headline blasted my name alongside the word fraud. Abigail Williams said, his voice clipped and entirely devoid of warmth. We have an asset freeze injunction sitting on our legal team's desk filed by your father. The grocery chain executives called me twice before sunrise. They are terrified. They want to know why the founder of the company they are buying is being sued for 50% of her equity by her own flesh and blood. I kept my posture rigid, refusing to let them see the absolute panic gripping my chest. I explained that the lawsuit was completely fraudulent. I told them the contract was forged, that my father had never given me a single dime, and that this was nothing more than an extortion attempt by estranged relatives looking for a quick payout. I promised them I would crush the lawsuit in court. William shook his head, cutting me off before I could finish. We do not care about your family drama, Abigail. We care about the $50 million merger that is currently hanging by a thread. In corporate acquisitions, perception is reality. A messy, protracted legal battle will drag this company through the mud for years. It will trigger a complete audit of our intellectual property. The grocery chain will pull their offer by the end of the month, and our stock valuation will tank. We cannot afford a trial. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, delivering the final blow. You have 14 days to make this lawsuit disappear. We do not care how you do it. Pay them off, settle out of court, buy their silence. Just get it done. If this injunction is not lifted in exactly 2 weeks, the board will vote to invoke the morality and brand protection clause in your executive contract. The room spun slightly. I knew exactly what that meant. The morality clause was designed to protect the company from executives who brought public disgrace to the brand. If they invoked it, they would force me to step down as CEO of my own company. And worse, once I was out of the way, the board would simply use company funds to settle with my parents anyway, just to save the merger. My parents would walk away with millions of dollars they did not earn, and I would lose the empire I had sacrificed my youth to build. I looked around the table at the men and women I had made incredibly wealthy. There was no loyalty here, just cold, hard numbers. They were willing to hand my company over to the people who had thrown me out in the freezing snow, all to protect their profit margins. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them how my parents had drained my savings when I was 18, how they had left me with nothing but 2 garbage bags. But vulnerability holds no currency in a boardroom. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer, and looked William dead in the eye. You will have your resolution in 14 days, I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane in my chest. I walked out of that room knowing I was entirely on my own. My parents thought they had trapped me. The board thought they had cornered me. But they were about to learn what happens when you push a woman who has already survived the worst they could do. I left the boardroom and drove straight to the 64th floor of a steel and glass tower in the heart of downtown Chicago. My corporate attorney, Victoria, did not offer me a comforting cup of coffee or a sympathetic hug when I walked into her sprawling corner office. She was not a therapist. She was a legal predator who billed $800 an hour to dismantle corporate threats. And she was already staring at a copy of my father's lawsuit spread across her massive glass desk. I dropped my bag on a leather chair and walked over to look at the document that was threatening to destroy my entire life. It was a simple 1-page contract. The legal language claimed that in exchange for a $15,000 seed investment, Thomas Foster was entitled to 50% of any future revenue generated by my logistics ventures. But it was the bottom of the page that made the blood rush in my ears. My signature was sitting right there on the dotted line. It was undeniably my handwriting. The sharp angle of the capital A. The specific, hurried loop of the letter L. It was perfect. But I knew with absolute certainty that I had never signed a document giving my father half of Harvest Route. My brain raced, sifting through decades of painful memories, trying to find the source of that signature. Then it hit me with the force of a physical blow. The slant of the letters. The way I crossed my T perfectly centered. That was not how I signed my name today. That was exactly how I signed my name when I was a teenager. I looked at Victoria, my stomach churning with a toxic mixture of disgust and realization. It is a trace, I told her, pointing at the ink. When I was 18, desperately trying to get to my double shifts at the diner, I bought a beat-up used car. Because I had no credit history, my father co-signed the auto loan. He kept the original dealership paperwork in his filing cabinet. They had held on to a 15-year-old carbon copy of my signature. They had waited patiently in the shadows, watching my company grow from a single tiny warehouse into a $45 million national brand. And then they used that old auto loan to forge a contract, waiting for the exact right moment to weaponize it against me. Victoria sat back in her heavy leather chair and steepled her fingers together. I expected her to immediately draft a motion to dismiss the case based on fraud. Instead, her expression remained entirely flat. She explained the brutal, unforgiving reality of the legal system. Proving a traced signature is not like it looks in the movies, Victoria said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. We would have to hire forensic handwriting experts. We would have to enter a lengthy discovery phase, depose your parents, and ultimately take this to a full civil trial. I told her to hire the experts. I told her I did not care what it cost. I wanted them exposed. Victoria shook her head. A civil trial takes 2 years, Abigail. Your board of directors just gave you 14 days. The grocery chain executives will not wait 2 years for you to clear your name. They will cancel the $50 million merger by the end of the month. Your parents and their lawyer know exactly what they are doing. They designed this trap perfectly. They timed the filing to align with your merger announcement. They do not want a trial. They want you to panic. She leaned across the desk, her tone shifting from lawyer to pragmatist. Settle the case, she advised quietly. Offer them $10 million right now to make this go away. It feels like a massive unfair loss, but it protects the $50 million acquisition. You will still walk away incredibly wealthy, and you keep your title as chief executive officer. In corporate warfare, sometimes paying the ransom is the only way to save the hostage. I looked down at the forged signature. I saw my teenage self shivering on a frozen porch, while the people who were supposed to protect me locked the door from the inside. I saw the decade of sleep deprivation, the endless rejections from banks, the sheer force of will it took to build my company while they pretended I was dead. Paying them off was not just a business transaction. It was a surrender. It would mean they won. It would mean they could throw me away like garbage, let me build a kingdom, and then casually stroll in to claim the throne. I looked up at Victoria. I am not giving them a single dollar, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Not a dime. If we cannot win on defense, we go on the offense. Victoria warned me about the ticking clock. We have no leverage, she cautioned. They have nothing to lose, and you have everything to lose. That was exactly the problem. People who truly have nothing to lose do not orchestrate elaborate high-stakes corporate extortion schemes. They only take these massive legal risks when they are desperate. Why now? Why wait 15 years to magically appear at my award gala? There was a missing piece to this puzzle, and I was going to find it. I told Victoria to call David. David was a forensic accountant I kept on a very expensive retainer for auditing potential acquisition targets. He was a quiet, relentless numbers guy who could trace a single missing dollar through a maze of offshore shell companies. I did not want him looking at my corporate books. I wanted him to financially dissect my parents. Find everything I ordered. I want to know where they shop, what they owe, and who they are hiding from. Pull their property records, trace their bank accounts, and dig into my sister Chelsea and her husband. I want to know exactly how desperate they truly are. Victoria warned me that digging into their personal lives was a massive risk. If we provoked them without solid evidence, they would escalate the media war and completely destroy the merger before the board deadline. I told her to make the call anyway. I was going to tear my family's perfect suburban facade apart, brick by brick. They wanted to play a game of corporate extortion. They had no idea they had just handed me the rulebook. My parents realized very quickly that their intimidation tactics in the green room had failed. When my attorney sent a formal notice of our intent to fight the lawsuit, Thomas and Diane did not retreat. Instead, they weaponized the one thing they had spent their entire lives cultivating, their perfect suburban reputation. They attended a massive affluent Presbyterian church in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods outside the city. It was the kind of congregation where social status was disguised as fellowship, and my parents were masters of that particular game. For years, they had been the pristine pillars of their community. Now they used that community as their personal army. It started with carefully planted whispers during Sunday coffee hours. Diane began telling the elder board and the local charity committees that I had stolen my father and his proprietary logistics contacts to start Harvest Root. She spun a tragic tale of a rebellious, ungrateful daughter who took everything her family offered, built an empire on their backs, and then cruelly abandoned them in their twilight years. The rumors spread like a virus. My parents were brilliant at playing the victims. They knew exactly how to appeal to the traditional values of their peers, painting themselves as loving, heartbroken parents who just wanted their family whole again. But church gossip was not enough for them. They needed a larger audience. They needed to destroy my public image so thoroughly that my board of directors would be forced to fire me. 3 days after the gala, I walked into my office and found my chief operating officer staring blankly at the television mounted on the wall. The local morning news was broadcasting a live exclusive interview. There, sitting on a plush studio sofa, was my mother. Diane looked completely different from the woman who had sneered at me backstage. She was dressed in a modest, soft beige sweater, her makeup subtly done to make her look tired and frail. She held a tissue in her trembling hands. The morning show host leaned in with practiced sympathy, asking how it felt to be sued by her own daughter. Diane did not correct the host to say that they were the ones suing me. Instead, she let out a broken, perfectly timed sob. She looked directly into the camera, her eyes brimming with fake tears, and delivered a performance that deserved an Academy Award. She told the viewers that they had sacrificed their entire life savings to give me the seed money for my company. She claimed my father had spent countless nights drawing up the initial supply chain routes that made Harvest Root successful. We gave her everything, Diane choked out, wiping her eyes. We mortgaged our future so Abigail could have one, and the moment she made her first $1 million, she cut off our phone numbers. We have not seen our grandchildren. We have not been allowed at her home. We are just two aging parents who want our little girl back, and instead, she is trying to erase us from the company we helped build. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She did not just lie. She twisted the knife, preying on the sympathies of every parent watching that broadcast. I stood frozen in my office watching the woman who had packed my belongings in garbage bags and locked me out in the freezing snow play the role of a devastated, loving mother. The sheer audacity of her lies made the room spin. She was portraying herself as a martyr while actively trying to steal my entire life work. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. By noon, the public relations nightmare had spiraled completely out of control. My phone began to vibrate constantly with alerts. Our company's social media pages were flooded with thousands of angry comments. People were calling me a monster, a corporate vulture, and a soulless daughter. The phrase boycott Harvest Root began trending regionally, but the damage did not stop at angry internet comments. It bled directly into the foundation of my business. Harvest Root relied on a delicate network of local family-owned organic farms. These were hard-working traditional people who valued loyalty and integrity. By mid-afternoon, my procurement team was fielding calls from furious farmers. 3 of our biggest organic suppliers in the Midwest pulled out of their contracts, citing moral objections. They refused to do business with someone who would treat their own flesh and blood with such callous greed. Our supply chain, the very lifeblood of our $45 million company, was suddenly fracturing. The warehouse managers were reporting canceled deliveries, and the customer service lines were jammed with grocery stores, demanding explanations. My parents had struck a vital nerve. They knew that in the organic food industry, trust and community reputation were everything. By destroying my personal character, they were effectively starving my company. Then came the phone call that nearly brought me to my knees. It was Robert, the chief executive of our lead distribution partner. His fleet of trucks was responsible for moving 70% of our inventory across the country. Robert was a pragmatic, no-nonsense businessman, and his voice over the line was tight with frustration. "Abigail," he said, skipping any pleasantries, "I am looking at a public relations disaster that is directly impacting my trucks. My drivers are facing protesters at your loading docks. I have board members asking why we are partnered with a company embroiled in a toxic family fraud scandal." I tried to explain the situation to tell him that the lawsuit was entirely fabricated, but he cut me off. "The truth does not matter right now," he said flatly. "The optics are toxic. The grocery chain merger is already causing enough turbulence in our quarterly projections. I cannot risk my own company standing by a sinking ship. You need to fix this immediately, Abigail. If this media circus continues through the weekend, I will have no choice but to pause our distribution contract until the lawsuit is fully resolved." A pause in distribution meant undelivered food. It meant rotting inventory. It meant total financial collapse. My parents had cornered me perfectly. They had set my world on fire, leaving me with only 2 choices. Let my company burn to ashes, or hand them the matches and surrender. I sat in Victoria's corner office, the weight of the massive supply chain crisis pressing down on my chest like a physical stone. The television mounted on the far wall was muted, still broadcasting the local news ticker about my mother's tearful morning interview. I felt like I was suffocating in a room made of expensive glass and cold steel. Victoria paced the length of her Persian rug, her phone vibrating every few minutes, with urgent updates from our crisis management team. We were losing the public relations battle, and we were losing it faster than I could have ever imagined. Victoria stopped pacing and sat across from me, folding her hands neatly over her polished desk. "Playing defense is no longer a viable option," she said firmly. "We cannot wait for the legal system to slowly validate that the signature on that contract is a forgery. We cannot wait for a judge to see through your mother's calculated television performance. We need a weapon, Abigail. We need something so utterly devastating that Thomas and Diane will literally beg us to tear up that lawsuit before your board of directors reaches their 14-day deadline." That was the exact moment David walked into the room. He was my forensic accountant, a man who rarely spoke above a quiet, measured murmur, but could read a convoluted bank ledger the way a predator tracks footprints in the soft mud. I had hired him just 48 hours ago with one specific directive: tear into my parents' personal finances. I needed to know why they had suddenly crawled out of the woodwork after entirely ignoring my existence for a decade and a half. Happy, comfortable people do not ambush their estranged children at corporate galas. They do not risk federal perjury and fraud just to steal a piece of a logistics company. Desperation leaves a very specific financial trail, and I wanted David to follow it to the absolute end. David placed his leather briefcase on the table and pulled out a stack of thick manila folders. He did not look triumphant or eager. He looked like a surgeon about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. He handed the first folder to Victoria, and the second one directly to me. I opened the heavy cover and stared at the dense spreadsheets, the property records, and the credit reports. It was a chaotic labyrinth of numbers, red ink, and final warning notices. Your parents are not the wealthy, comfortable suburban retirees they pretend to be on Sunday mornings at their affluent church, David said quietly. They are completely and utterly bankrupt. I looked at the pages in absolute disbelief. My father had always obsessed over appearances. He wore expensive, tailored suits and leased imported cars to ensure the neighbors knew he was successful. My mother treated her country club membership like a sacred religious obligation. But the highly sensitive documents resting in my hands told a completely different, horrifying story. They had taken out 3 separate mortgages on their pristine 5-bedroom suburban home. Their credit cards were maxed out to the absolute limit. They had 0 retirement savings left. They were drowning in millions of dollars of high-interest debt to predatory private lenders, and the bank was quietly preparing to foreclose on their house in less than 30 days. The lawsuit was not a calculated business move. It was a panicked, last-ditch effort to save themselves from total social and financial ruin. They saw my $45 million company featured in the business journals, and they viewed me as their personal lottery ticket. They needed millions of dollars in cash immediately to survive, and they were perfectly willing to destroy my reputation, my career, and my entire life to get it. But as shocking as my parents' financial ruin was, David was not finished. He leaned forward and tapped a specific page in my folder. Thomas and Diane are desperate, David explained. But desperate people are incredibly stubborn. They will fight this lawsuit to the bitter end because they have absolutely nothing left to lose. If we confront them with their bankruptcy, they will just double down on their media victim narrative. We cannot use this information to force them to drop the lawsuit. I felt a fresh wave of panic rising in my throat. If their impending bankruptcy was not enough to stop them, what was? We need a weak link, Victoria said, her sharp eyes scanning the financial documents. We need someone connected to them who actually has something significant to lose. Someone we can break. David nodded slowly and slid a final separate folder across the glass table. That is exactly what I found, he said. The real vulnerability in your family is not your father or your mother. It is your brother-in-law. I stared at the name printed on the tab of the folder. Greg. My golden sister Chelsea had married him 5 years ago. He was a local real estate developer, the kind of guy who wore flashy custom watches and constantly bragged at family functions about his booming property portfolio. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on. They paraded him around their social circles as the ultimate success story, a man who provided Chelsea with a life of absolute luxury and ease. Greg is not a successful developer, David said, his voice dropping to a serious, heavy tone. He is a massive fraud. Thomas and Diane drained their life savings and mortgaged their home 3 times over to secretly fund Greg's failing real estate flips. Your parents went bankrupt trying to prop up his illusion of wealth. But that is not the worst part. Greg has been hiding the true severity of this catastrophic debt from Chelsea and your parents. I looked up at David, my heart pounding as he delivered the final crushing blow. To keep his luxury lifestyle afloat and delay the inevitable collapse, Greg has been committing massive financial crimes, David explained. We found the definitive proof. He has been illegally siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from his clients' escrow accounts. It is federal wire fraud, Abigail. He is looking at years in federal prison. And right now you are the only person who knows his secret. The heavy cream folder David slid across the table felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Inside those thick bound pages was the complete financial autopsy of the family that threw me out into the snow 15 years ago. I opened the cover, expecting to see healthy retirement accounts, robust stock portfolios, and comfortable pension plans. My parents, Thomas and Diane, had spent their entire lives aggressively cultivating an image of impenetrable upper-middle-class perfection. They were the kind of people who judged their neighbors for buying last year's luxury car model. They sat in the front pew of their sprawling Presbyterian church as if they personally owned the building. Diane hosted lavish charity luncheons just to make sure everyone saw her imported crystal, while Thomas bragged loudly about his investment strategies on the golf course. But the spreadsheets staring back at me painted a horrifying picture of absolute and terrifying ruin. David leaned over and tapped a column of red ink with his silver pen. He explained that my parents did not just have a mortgage on their pristine suburban home. They had 3. Over the past 5 years, Thomas and Diane had systematically drained every single ounce of equity out of the estate they loved so much. They had quietly liquidated their retirement portfolios, emptied their savings accounts, and borrowed heavily against assets they barely owned anymore. I asked David where all that cash went. Millions of dollars do not just vanish into thin air without leaving a spectacular trail of wreckage. He flipped the page, revealing a chaotic web of wire transfers and bank drafts, all flowing into a single, disastrous black hole. Chelsea and her husband Greg, my golden child sister, and her flashy real estate developer husband had been running a luxury house flipping business that was completely bleeding cash. They were buying massive and overpriced properties they could not sell, racking up astronomical carrying costs, and relying entirely on my parents to bail them out month after agonizing month. Thomas and Diane had sacrificed their entire financial existence, burning through their life savings to prop up Chelsea's illusion of a perfect wealthy marriage. It was not just standard bank loans that funded this madness. Traditional lenders had looked at their debt-to-income ratio and cut my parents off years ago. To keep up appearances and keep Chelsea living in luxury, Thomas had turned to predatory private lenders. He took out hard money loans with suffocating double-digit interest rates designed to trap desperate borrowers. David pointed to the bottom line of the summary page, highlighting a number that made my stomach drop. My parents were currently drowning under $4 million of toxic, unmanageable debt. They were bleeding thousands of dollars a day just in interest payments alone. The documents showed 3 separate final warning notices from the private lenders. My parents were exactly 3 weeks away from total foreclosure. 3 weeks away from the bank chaining the doors of their immaculate suburban estate. 3 weeks away from dragging their humiliating financial collapse into the blinding light of public record, right in front of their entire affluent social circle. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. For 2 days I had been agonizing over why my parents chose this exact moment to ambush me at my awards gala. I genuinely thought they were launching a calculated and long-term corporate takeover of Harvest Root. I thought they actually wanted to steal and run my organic logistics empire. But staring at the crushing reality of their $4 million debt, I finally understood the absolute truth. This frivolous and forged lawsuit was not a brilliant legal strategy. It was a panicked and flailing grab for a life raft by drowning people. They saw my company making national headlines. They saw the $50 million merger announcement with the major grocery chain. They knew a corporate chief executive officer on the verge of a massive acquisition could not afford a public scandal. They filed the lawsuit entirely hoping I would panic and throw a massive settlement check at them just to make the bad press disappear. They did not actually want 50% equity in a company they did not understand. They wanted $10 million in quick, untraceable cash to pay off their loan sharks and save their house before the country club crowd found out they were entirely broke. They had weaponized my hard-earned reputation because they had completely destroyed their own. They assumed I was still that scared and helpless 18-year-old girl who would back down from a fight and empty her pockets just to keep the peace. They assumed I would crack under the immense pressure of my board of directors and hand over my wealth to fund Chelsea's fake lifestyle, exactly like they demanded when they stole my college savings 15 years ago. I closed the heavy folder and pushed it back across the glass table toward David. The lingering fear that had been gripping my chest since the gala completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp, and absolute focus. My parents had built a towering house of cards on a fragile foundation of lies and predatory debt. They were cornered animals, and cornered animals always make careless and fatal mistakes. They marched into my ballroom thinking they were the predators in this scenario, but they had just handed me the exact map of their own destruction. I stared at the heavy manila folder sitting on Victoria's desk. Inside was the blueprint to my brother-in-law's entirely fraudulent existence. David, my forensic accountant, had meticulously mapped out exactly how Greg was keeping his sinking ship afloat. It was a calculated, ongoing criminal enterprise. Greg handled massive amounts of cash for his real estate clients. He held their earnest money in legally protected escrow accounts. That money was supposed to be untouchable. Instead, Greg was using those accounts like his own personal bank. Whenever his credit cards maxed out, or Chelsea demanded a luxury vacation to maintain her social media image, Greg simply wired client funds into his checking account. He was constantly moving money to cover the gaps before his clients noticed. It was a Ponzi scheme built on suburban entitlement, and it was highly illegal. Federal wire fraud carries a sentence of 20 years per count. David had documented 14 separate illegal transfers. Victoria steepled her fingers together. "Your parents are dangerous because they are completely delusional," she explained quietly. "Thomas and Diane genuinely believe they are entitled to your company. You cannot reason with zealots. But Greg is different. Greg is not a zealot. Greg is a coward." She was right. Greg did not care about the fabricated story of my father funding my empire. He only cared about saving his own skin. He had allowed my parents to mortgage their house 3 times over to fund his failing projects because he was terrified of Chelsea finding out the truth. He was a man entirely motivated by fear. If we attacked my parents directly, they would drag my name through the mud until the grocery chain merger collapsed. But if I applied pressure to Greg, he would shatter. I just needed to break their weakest link and force him to destroy the lawsuit from the inside. I told David to find out exactly where Greg would be the following afternoon. I needed to isolate him completely. I could not let my father or his aggressive lawyer be anywhere near the conversation. David tracked his daily habits, discovering that Greg spent every Wednesday afternoon at an upscale country club lounge. He claimed he was networking, but the receipts showed he was just drinking expensive scotch on my parents' dime. The next day at 2 o'clock, I walked into that dimly lit lounge. I spotted Greg sitting in a corner booth, wearing a tailored navy suit and a luxury watch paid for with stolen money. I walked over and slid into the leather booth directly across from him. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening in brief panic before he plastered on his signature arrogant smirk. "Abigail," he said, letting out a condescending chuckle. "I thought your lawyers told you not to speak to us. Are you finally ready to write that settlement check so we can all move on?" I did not smile. I unclasped my briefcase, pulled out a sleek black folder, and placed it squarely in the middle of the table. "I am not here to negotiate a settlement, Greg," I said, keeping my tone deadly flat. "I am here to explain what is going to happen to you if that lawsuit is not dropped by 5 o'clock tomorrow evening." Greg scoffed, pushing the folder away. "You have no leverage, Abby. Your distribution partners are pausing their contracts. You are losing millions. You are going to pay us, or we will burn Harvest Root to the ground." "Open the folder," I replied, staring straight into his eyes. He hesitated, the arrogant smirk faltering at the absolute certainty in my voice. He flipped open the cover. Sitting on top was a printed bank statement. I watched his eyes scan the page. I watched the exact moment his brain registered the routing numbers. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening gray. "That is a detailed record of the $75,000 you illegally wired from the Peterson escrow account to your personal checking account last Thursday," I said softly, ensuring every word cut like a scalpel. "On the next page is the paper trail showing how you used that stolen client money to pay off the private loan shark debt your father-in-law took out to save your failing commercial property." Greg opened his mouth to speak, but his jaw just trembled. The glass of scotch shook violently in his hand before he set it down. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us. "My forensic accountant has spent 48 hours tearing through your life. I have undeniable proof of 14 counts of federal wire fraud. I have the bank statements, the forged authorization slips, and the wire confirmation numbers. Chelsea has no idea you are broke, does she? She has no idea she is driving a car paid for with stolen funds. And my parents have no idea the money they desperately needed to save their home was gambled away on your sheer incompetence." "You cannot prove this," he choked out, sweating. "You obtained these records illegally. They are inadmissible. I am not taking them to civil court, I whispered, leaning back into the cushions. I am handing them directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I do not care if my company takes a public relations hit. I will survive. I have survived worse than you and my father combined. But you will not survive federal prison. You are going to go home today, and you are going to tell Thomas and Diane that the lawsuit is over. You are going to make them withdraw the injunction, or I will make a single phone call that ends your entire life. You have exactly 24 hours to convince them to surrender. I stood up, leaving the black folder on the table. I did not look back as I walked out of the lounge, leaving him completely paralyzed in the corner booth, staring at the absolute destruction of his fake empire. I needed to find the weak link in my family's treacherous chain, and my brother-in-law was the ultimate fragile target. David had done his job flawlessly. He tracked Greg and his daily routine down to the very minute. While my sister Chelsea was busy shopping at luxury boutiques to pretend she was still wealthy, Greg was hiding from his mounting and terrifying failures. Every single Thursday afternoon, Greg held court at the Oakmont Valley Golf Club. It was a highly exclusive sanctuary for men who loved to pretend they owned the world. I drove my car up the long, meticulously manicured driveway, feeling a profound sense of purpose. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and expensive imported cigars. I bypassed the valet, parked my vehicle, and walked straight through the heavy mahogany front doors. The club manager tried to stop me at the front desk, but I flashed a cold smile and stated clearly that I was joining my brother-in-law for a private meeting. I found him exactly where David said he would be. He was sitting on the sprawling outdoor terrace overlooking the 18th hole, holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch. He looked so comfortable, so ridiculously secure in his stolen luxury, laughing loudly with another man about golf scores. I waited until the other man stood up and walked away before I made my approach. I pulled out the chair directly across from Greg and sat down without an invitation. The heavy ice in his glass clinked loudly as his hand jolted in absolute surprise. He tried to quickly recover his composure. He pasted on that smug, practiced smile he always used at family dinners to talk down to me. He dragged out the syllables of my name, asking if my high-priced corporate lawyers had finally let me out of my cage to surrender. I did not smile back. I did not offer a polite greeting or acknowledge his pathetic attempt at humor. I reached into my leather tote bag, pulled out a thick black folder, and dropped it squarely onto the polished teak table between us. I told him I was not there to negotiate a settlement with a parasite. I kept my voice low and dangerously calm. I ordered him to open the folder. Greg scoffed at my tone. He looked around nervously to see if anyone at the adjacent tables was watching our interaction, but the afternoon terrace was mostly empty. With a heavy sigh of feigned annoyance, he reluctantly flipped open the cover. It took less than 10 seconds for the artificial tan to completely drain from his face. His eyes darted frantically across the pages. He was absorbing the bank routing numbers, the highlighted wire transfers, and the specific dates of every single transaction he thought he had successfully buried. I leaned forward so he could hear every syllable over the gentle rustle of the terrace breeze. I told him that the folder contained a highly detailed and legally sound ledger of his real estate firm over the past 3 years. I explained that it showed exactly how he had been illegally siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars out of his clients' protected escrow accounts. He had been stealing from innocent people to pay off the predatory loan sharks his father-in-law had hired to keep his failing business afloat. I watched his throat swallow hard. His arrogant posture collapsed like a deflated balloon, his shoulders slumping forward in defeat. He stammered weakly, his voice cracking as he claimed, "I could not just walk in with stolen bank records because it was illegal." I smiled then, a cold and predatory smile that I had perfected in corporate boardrooms over the last decade. I told him I did not need the documents to be admissible in a civil court trial. I only needed to hand them over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I listed his crimes slowly. Wire fraud across state lines, embezzlement, the gross misappropriation of client funds. I made sure to emphasize that the federal sentencing guidelines for his specific brand of financial crimes carried a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I watched the terrifying realization wash over him. Greg was a coward who liked tailored suits and fine dining. He would not survive a single week in a federal prison cell. I told him he was entirely broke, that he was a massive fraud, and that right now I held his entire miserable life in the palm of my hand. He looked around wildly, panting like a trapped animal, searching for an exit that simply did not exist. He gripped the edge of the table and choked out a statement asking what I wanted. He pleaded that if I exposed him, Chelsea would lose absolutely everything, and my parents would likely face criminal conspiracy charges. I stared at him, letting the absolute weight of my silence press down on his chest. I told him I did not care about Chelsea. I told him I certainly did not care about Thomas or Diane. I only cared about the logistics company I built from nothing while his precious in-laws left me to freeze in the snow 15 years ago. But I was willing to offer him a very specific one-time only deal. I pointed directly at the black folder sitting between us. I promised I would take that devastating evidence, put it through an industrial paper shredder, and never speak of his massive escrow fraud again. He would get to walk away and figure out how to clean up his own financial mess in private. But in exchange for his freedom, he was going to do exactly what I demanded. His eyes widened with a pathetic, desperate glimmer of hope. He whispered that he would do anything. I leaned back and crossed my arms. I told him he was going to get me inside my father's house that very night. I knew Thomas kept his most important files locked in a heavy safe inside his home office. I needed the original unphotocopied version of that forged contract to prove the ink was freshly laid. I ordered Greg to unlock the back door, quietly bypass the security alarm system, and give me exactly 10 minutes alone in that room. I told him if he refused or tried to warn them, I would make the call to the federal authorities before I even pulled my car out of the golf club parking lot. Greg stared at me completely broken and slowly nodded his head. I watched the last shred of Greg's artificial bravado completely evaporate into the warm afternoon air. Sweat beaded along his hairline, soaking into the collar of his tailored shirt. He reached for a linen napkin and wiped his forehead with trembling hands. The man who had spent years acting like a titan of real estate was now visibly hyperventilating over a single black folder. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the terrace before leaning in closer to me. He whispered that my parents were attending a highly publicized charity luncheon at their church the following afternoon. It was a sprawling, catered affair, where they planned to continue their vicious smear campaign against me to anyone who would listen. They were expected to be gone for at least 4 hours. Greg explained that Chelsea had a standing spa appointment across town, at the exact same time leaving the suburban property completely empty. I kept my expression entirely neutral, absorbing the timeline. I asked him how he planned to get me past the perimeter. My father was paranoid about his wealth, and had installed a state-of-the-art security system years ago. Greg wiped his face again and told me he still had the master administrative code saved in his phone. He promised to remotely deactivate the exterior cameras and the silent alarm grid at exactly 1 o'clock the next day. He told me he would physically go to the house an hour beforehand. While inside, he would unlock the heavy deadbolt on the rear patio door leading directly into the sunroom. I leaned back in my chair and looked at him with absolute disgust. He was selling out his own family with terrifying speed to save himself from federal prison. I told him that if I arrived at that property and found the door locked, or if a single siren sounded, I would instantly email the contents of my black folder to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I would not call him. I would not warn him. Greg nodded frantically, swearing on his life that the path would be completely clear. I stood up, leaving him shaking in the corner booth, and walked back to my car. The moment I closed the driver's side door, the adrenaline holding me together instantly crashed. My hands began to shake uncontrollably against the steering wheel. The reality of what I had just agreed to do settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I was the chief executive officer of a national logistics company. I was 3 weeks away from closing a massive corporate merger. And tomorrow afternoon, I was going to commit a felony. I drove to a quiet coffee shop on the edge of the city to meet David. My forensic accountant was sitting at a back table tracing the last few threads of my brother-in-law's fraudulent empire. I sat down across from him and relayed the exact details of the arrangement I had made with Greg. David did not look shocked, but the lines around his eyes tightened with severe concern. He closed his laptop and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a serious murmur. He warned me that we were crossing a massive and incredibly dangerous line. Extracting financial records through digital forensics was one thing, but physically breaking into a residence was burglary. If my parents came home early, or if Greg lost his nerve and secretly called the police to trap me, I would be arrested on the spot. David laid out the brutal stakes of our plan. If I was caught inside that house, my father would not hesitate to press criminal charges. The mugshot of the Harvest Root founder being arrested for breaking and entering would be broadcast on every national news network within the hour. The conservative board of directors would instantly invoke the morality clause terminating me before I even made bail. The grocery chain merger would instantly die, and I would spend the next decade fighting criminal charges, while my parents sued my shattered company for millions. I listened to David explain every catastrophic risk, letting the terrifying truth wash over me. I had spent 15 years building a flawless professional reputation. I had sacrificed my entire youth working 80-hour weeks, sleeping on warehouse floors, and bleeding for my business. One wrong move tomorrow afternoon, one slipped lock or triggered sensor, and I would lose absolutely everything I had built. I would be handing my parents the ultimate victory on a silver platter, but I also knew that if I did not find the original unphotocopied version of that forged contract, the slow turning wheels of the civil justice system would drain my company dry. The board had given me 14 days to make the lawsuit disappear. I could not wait for handwriting experts to testify in a courtroom 2 years from now. I needed the physical evidence in my hands, and I needed it immediately. I looked at David and told him there was no other option. My parents had backed me into a corner where survival required playing by their ruthless rules. I asked him to map out the fastest route from the rear patio door to my father's home office. We spent the next 2 hours going over the blueprints of the house I had not stepped foot inside since I was a teenager. We memorized the layout, calculated the blind spots, and built a rigid timeline. We would have exactly 10 minutes to get in, crack the heavy safe, find the forged document, and vanish without a trace. As the sun set over Chicago, casting long, dark shadows across the city skyline, the true weight of the impending break-in anchored itself in my chest. I drove back to my apartment in total silence, mentally preparing for the most dangerous gamble of my entire life. Tomorrow I was going to walk straight back into the very house where my nightmares began. The tires of David's unmarked sedan crunched softly against the pristine gravel of my parents' driveway. It was exactly 12:55 in the afternoon. The sprawling suburban neighborhood was dead quiet, bathed in the warm, deceptive light of a Tuesday. Manicured lawns stretched out in every direction, boasting the quiet, expensive peace that my parents had spent their entire lives worshipping. I stared up at the massive colonial house I had not seen in 15 years. The white pillars and dark shutters looked exactly the same. It was a monument to their supposed success, a fortress built on absolute lies. David cut the engine and gave me a silent nod. We stepped out of the car, moving quickly and quietly around the side of the garage toward the rear patio. My chest was tight, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Every step felt like walking through deep water. Greg had sworn he would leave the back door unlocked and disable the security grid. But Greg was a coward. If he had panicked, if he had confessed my ambush to Thomas and Diane, a blaring alarm would trigger the moment I touched that door handle. The police would arrive in minutes. My company, my reputation, and my freedom would be instantly destroyed. I reached out and wrapped my trembling fingers around the heavy brass handle of the sunroom door. I took a deep breath, squeezed my eyes shut, and pushed. The handle turned smoothly. The door swung open in absolute silence. Greg had actually kept his word. We slipped inside, closing the glass door behind us. The air in the house smelled overwhelmingly familiar. A cloying mixture of expensive floral room spray and lemon furniture polish. On the surface, the interior looked like a glossy spread from a luxury design magazine. The living room featured imported silk drapes, pristine white sofas, and crystal vases catching the afternoon sunlight. But as David and I moved cautiously through the massive designer kitchen, the cracks in their perfect facade became glaringly obvious. My parents were drowning, and the evidence was hiding in plain sight. On the vast marble island tucked hastily behind a silver fruit bowl was a massive stack of unopened mail. The envelopes bore the harsh, undeniable stamps of collection agencies and final notices. A bright pink foreclosure warning peeked out from under a glossy catalog. The refrigerator door, devoid of any family photos, held a sticky note from a private lending company demanding immediate contact. They were living in a beautiful, hollow shell, surrounded by expensive things they could no longer afford, desperately clinging to a social status that was weeks away from completely evaporating. We moved past the kitchen and headed down the long carpeted hallway toward my father's home office. My legs felt heavy. This was the exact hallway where I had begged my parents to listen to me 15 years ago. This was the floor I had stood on when I realized they had stolen my hard-earned college savings to cover my sister's reckless mistakes. The phantom echo of my father's voice telling me to get out seemed to vibrate in the polished hardwood. For a fleeting second, the terrified teenager inside me wanted to turn around and run. I wanted to escape this house of horrors, but I was not that scared, discarded girl anymore. I was a woman who had built an empire from nothing, and I was here to take my life back. I let the cold, righteous anger wash over me, anchoring my boots to the floor. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors of the office. The room was exactly as imposing as I remembered. Dark wood paneling, a massive mahogany desk, and walls lined with locked filing cabinets. David immediately went to work. He pulled a sleek set of tension tools from his pocket and knelt beside the first row of metal drawers. The clock was ticking. We had agreed on a strict 10-minute window. Any longer, and the risk of a neighbor noticing our car or my parents returning early would multiply exponentially. The sharp click of the first lock giving way sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. David pulled the drawer open, and we began tearing through the hanging folders. We sifted through decades of financial ruins, tax returns, denied loan applications, and aggressive letters from creditors. My father had kept meticulous records of his own demise, but the forged contract was nowhere to be found. 5 minutes vanished. Then 7. Panic began to prickle at the back of my neck. We checked the desk drawers, the leather-bound ledgers on the shelves, even the hollow space behind the framed diplomas on the wall. Nothing. "We are running out of time," David whispered, his eyes scanning the room with frantic precision. "If it is not in the cabinets, he has it secured somewhere else. A firebox, a wall safe." I forced myself to think like Thomas Foster. He was a man obsessed with control and hidden leverage. He would never leave his golden ticket sitting in a standard metal drawer. I looked at the massive built-in bookshelf behind his desk. The bottom row of heavy legal encyclopedias looked slightly uneven. I rushed around the desk, dropped to my knees, and pulled the thick books away from the wall. Hidden behind the false backing was a heavy steel wall safe with a digital keypad. My heart sank. I did not know the code. We had exactly 2 minutes left. David dropped down beside me, examining the keypad. "People like your father never use random numbers," he said quietly. "They use numbers that validate their ego. Birthdays, anniversaries." I typed in his birthday. The keypad blinked red. I typed in my parents' anniversary. Another red light. The silence in the house suddenly felt deafening. I thought about what my father truly valued above everything else in the world. I thought about the golden child. I typed in Chelsea's birthday. The light flashed a brilliant, beautiful green. The heavy steel door clicked and popped ajar. I pulled it open, my hands shaking violently. The safe was crammed with property deeds and hard money loan agreements. I dug past the heavy stacks of paper, reaching the very bottom of the dark steel box. My fingers brushed against a smooth, bright red folder. There were no labels, no identifying marks. I pulled it out and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. Resting inside, perfectly preserved and uncreased, was the original contract. I stared at my own forged signature sitting at the bottom of the page. Without the blurry degradation of a photocopy, the truth was blindingly obvious. You could see the faint indentations on the paper where someone had pressed hard to trace the letters from my old auto loan. You could see the slight hesitation in the ink flow, the unnatural perfection of a signature that was drawn rather than signed. I had it. The physical, undeniable proof that my parents had tried to steal my $45 million company based on a complete and utter lie. I carefully slid the red folder into my bag and looked at David. "We are done," I said, my voice finally steady. "Let us go end this. The heavy steel door of my father's hidden wall safe hung open, casting a pale, unnatural glow across the mahogany floorboards of his office. I knelt there on the expensive Persian rug, the unmarked red folder resting heavily in my lap. My forensic accountant, David, knelt right beside me, his breathing shallow and controlled, in the suffocating silence of the massive suburban house. We were intruders in a pristine fortress of lies, but what I held in my hands was the absolute truth. I slowly peeled back the thick cardstock cover, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the edges of the paper inside. It was the original contract, the very document Thomas Foster had shoved into my chest backstage at my gala, claiming he owned 50% of my $45 million logistics empire. But seeing the raw physical copy revealed a story that a photocopy never could. I ran my fingertips over the bottom right corner of the page. The ink on my supposed signature was too thick, pooling slightly at the edges of the letters, in a way that screamed unnatural hesitation. I turned the page, and the breath completely vanished from my lungs. Stapled to the back of the fraudulent agreement was a thin, translucent sheet of tracing paper. Beneath that tracing paper sat a yellowed, slightly crumpled permission slip from my senior year of high school. It was a standard authorization form for a field trip, completely mundane, except for the fact that it bore my authentic 18-year-old signature. My father had kept it. He had hoarded a meaningless piece of my teenage life for 15 years, just waiting for the perfect moment to weaponize it. I stared at the faint graphite indentations on the tracing paper perfectly aligning with the heavy black ink of the forged contract. It was not just a lie. It was a meticulously crafted, undeniable forgery. I looked up at David, my heart hammering a frantic, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. "We have it," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "We have the absolute proof to clear my name." David nodded, his eyes scanning the contents of the red folder. But his professional gaze did not stop there. He reached past me, slipping his hand into the dark, cavernous interior of the steel safe. "There is more in here, Abigail," he murmured, pulling out a thick, tightly bound stack of legal-sized documents. "People who forge one document rarely stop at one." He set the heavy stack on the carpet between us, snapping the rubber band off the top with a sharp thwack. I shifted my focus to the new pile of paperwork, adjusting my eyes to the dense text. The header on the first page belonged to a massive national commercial bank. My eyes darted across the columns of fine print, the complex financial jargon, and the aggressive terms of a high-risk commercial loan. But it was the applicant information that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. The name listed as the primary guarantor was Abigail Foster. Below my name, printed in stark black ink, was my personal social security number. I flipped frantically to the second page, then the third, my mind struggling to process the sheer volume of deceit. It was not just one application. It was an entire mountain of them. 4 weeks ago, while I was agonizing over supply chain logistics and preparing for a $50 million corporate merger, my father had systematically applied for $300,000 in fraudulent business loans under my identity. The breathtaking audacity of the crime anchored me to the floor. Thomas had not just tried to extort me for a quick payout to save his drowning real estate investments. When his private loan sharks started circling, when the threat of foreclosure became an undeniable reality, he decided to completely steal my identity. He used the social security number he had memorized from my childhood. He leveraged the pristine credit score I had spent a decade building from scratch. He attempted to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into his bankrupt accounts, leaving me holding the bag for his catastrophic failures. This was not a civil dispute over a fabricated silent partnership. This was malicious, calculated identity theft. David picked up one of the applications, his forensic mind instantly categorizing the immense severity of the crime. He looked at me, the gravity of the situation etched into every line of his face. "Abigail," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a judge reading a final sentence. "Proving a forged civil contract would have taken us years in a courtroom. It would have bled your company dry and ruined your merger. But this?" He tapped the fraudulent loan document with a decisive finger. "This changes the entire battlefield." Identity theft of this magnitude combined with bank fraud across state lines carries a mandatory federal prison sentence. Your father crossed a line that he can never walk back from. I sat back on the floor, the cold reality of my parents' absolute betrayal washing over me in relentless waves. For 15 years, I had carried the heavy, suffocating burden of being the discarded daughter. I had laid awake at night wondering why I was not enough for them, why they had chosen my sister's reckless mistakes over my survival. But looking at the mountain of fraudulent documents scattered across the Persian rug, the last lingering ghost of that insecure teenage girl completely evaporated. My parents did not throw me away because I was worthless. They threw me away because they were empty, hollow people who consumed everything good around them to fuel their own illusions. They had marched into my gala thinking they held the ultimate leverage to steal my crown. They had launched a vicious media campaign to paint me as a monster, hoping I would crack under the immense pressure of public opinion. But they had tragically miscalculated. I slowly gathered the original forged contract, the tracing paper, and the massive stack of fraudulent loan applications, sliding them carefully into my black leather briefcase. I zipped the bag shut with a sharp, resounding click. I did not just hold the key to saving my company anymore. I held the absolute power to send the people who destroyed my youth directly to a federal penitentiary. The air inside Victoria's corner office felt completely different this morning. The frantic, suffocating panic that had been drowning me for the past 12 days was entirely gone. It was replaced by the cold, sharp, and absolute precision of a steel trap waiting to snap shut. The board of directors had handed me a rigid, non-negotiable 14-day deadline to extinguish the catastrophic media firestorm my parents had ignited. We were now on day 12. If I did not present a signed, legally binding resolution by the end of the week, the conservative board was going to forcefully vote me out of Harvest Road. They were preparing to strip me of the very logistics empire I had sacrificed my entire youth to build. I sat calmly across the polished glass table from Victoria, my eyes locked on the black leather briefcase resting between us. That bag held the absolute destruction of Thomas and Diane Foster. Inside sat the original forged contract, the fragile sheet of tracing paper, my stolen high school permission slip, and the horrifying stack of fraudulent commercial loan applications my father had illegally secured using my childhood social security number. I possessed the undeniable power to send my father to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. But I did not want to simply hand the files over to the authorities in the quiet shadows of a police precinct. I wanted my parents to feel the exact devastating moment their towering house of cards collapsed. I wanted them to march willingly, arrogantly right into their own demise. To execute this, I needed them to believe they had won the war. I needed to feed their insatiable suburban greed until they choked on it. I looked across the desk at Victoria and gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was time to wave the white flag of surrender. Victoria picked up her desk phone and dialed the direct line for Robert Vance. He was the sleazy, aggressive, heavily televised attorney my parents had hired on contingency to orchestrate this massive corporate shakedown. She pressed the speaker button, filling the quiet office with the harsh sound of a ringing line. When Vance finally answered, his voice dripped with a familiar, sickeningly unearned arrogance. He sounded exactly like a man who was already shopping for a yacht with his anticipated percentage of my life's work. Victoria took a deep breath, and I watched her instantly transform. Gone was the ruthless, impenetrable corporate litigator. In her place sat a frantic, exhausted lawyer desperately trying to salvage a sinking ship. She pitched her voice slightly higher, carefully injecting a subtle, vibrating tremor of panic into her words. She told Vance that the ongoing media circus was completely destroying our national supply chain. She claimed our largest distribution partners were actively pausing their lucrative contracts, and that my $50 million grocery merger was on the verge of total collapse. Victoria painted a pathetic, highly believable picture of me pacing my office, in tears, utterly terrified of losing my position as chief executive officer, and willing to do absolutely anything to make the financial bleeding stop. Vance let out a wet, condescending chuckle that made the hair on my arms stand up. He gloated shamelessly, loudly reminding Victoria that his clients held all the leverage, and that my father was simply claiming his rightful hard-earned half of the family empire. Then Victoria dropped the ultimate bait. She told him I was entirely broken and fully prepared to surrender. To avoid a protracted multi-year legal battle and save my impending merger, I was offering a complete and immediate buyout of Thomas and Diane's alleged 50% equity stake. Victoria let the silence hang over the speakerphone for a single, agonizing heartbeat before delivering the number. $20 million. Cold, untraceable cash. Wired directly into their accounts the exact second the settlement papers were signed, and the injunction was permanently lifted. The line went completely breathlessly dead. I could practically hear the greedy, desperate gears grinding in Vance's head as he furiously calculated his massive 1/3 cut of a $20 million payout. He coughed, attempting to maintain his aggressive facade, and pompously stated that $20 million was a reasonable starting point for negotiations. Victoria immediately cut him off, elevating the desperation in her tone to an award-winning level. She frantically insisted there were no further negotiations. She explained that $20 million represented every single liquid asset I could legally leverage without triggering a catastrophic audit from my board of directors. She sold it as my absolute final offer, a complete and humiliating capitulation to save my job. Vance arrogantly told her he needed to formally consult his clients, but the underlying vibrating excitement in his voice completely gave him away. He abruptly hung up the phone. Victoria and I sat in total silence, staring at the black speaker on her desk, waiting for the poison to take effect. Exactly 15 minutes later, the phone rang. It was Vance. He proudly, smugly announced that Thomas and Diane had graciously decided to accept my offer. They were ready to drop the fraudulent lawsuit, cancel the injunction, and walk away a staggering $20 million richer. Chelsea had even chimed in from the background, her shrill voice practically weeping with joy over the incoming wealth. But Thomas Foster was a man entirely fueled by malicious ego and control. The astronomical sum of money was simply not enough. He needed to dominate me publicly. Vance relayed their final non-negotiable condition. My parents absolutely refused to sign the settlement documents in a neutral private law office. They demanded a formal, highly visible signing ceremony, and they demanded it take place at the Harvest Root headquarters, right in the center of my executive boardroom. The psychology behind the demand was perfectly clear. They wanted to walk into the massive glass and steel building I had built from the ground up and parade around like conquering royalty. They wanted my loyal staff to see them. They wanted to sit in my leather chairs, drink my expensive coffee, and watch me physically hand over my hard-earned wealth to fund Chelsea's fake luxury lifestyle and cover Greg's massive federal embezzlement. They wanted to look me in the eye and watch me break. Victoria immediately muted the phone, looking at me with a sharply raised eyebrow. I smiled, feeling a dark, profound sense of vindication settling deep into my bones. This was exactly what I wanted. I gave her a firm nod. Victoria unmuted the line and told Vance we completely agreed to their humiliating terms. The signing would happen tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp in my executive boardroom. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the black briefcase. My parents thought they had successfully crushed the quiet, obedient daughter they threw out into the snow 15 years ago. They thought they were marching into my sanctuary to finally steal my crown. They had absolutely no idea they were marching directly into a federal trap. The polished mahogany table in the center of the Harvest Root executive boardroom was large enough to seat 20 people. I walked the length of it, slowly trailing my fingertips over the cool wood, making sure every single leather chair was perfectly aligned. The room was a cohesive sanctuary of glass and steel suspended high above the Chicago skyline. It was the physical manifestation of my sleepless nights, my relentless ambition, and the empire I had built entirely without the family who threw me away. Today, it was going to serve as an execution chamber. Their attorney, Robert Vance, had forwarded a list of demands for the signing ceremony that morning. The sheer arrogance of the document was staggering. It read less like a corporate legal schedule and more like a royal coronation. Thomas explicitly demanded the grand leather chair at the absolute head of the table. Diane requested a specific brand of imported sparkling water with fresh raspberries. Chelsea insisted on a spread of artisan pastries from a high-end bakery downtown. They wanted to march into my corporate fortress and treat my staff like their personal servants. They wanted to gorge themselves on their artificial victory and watch me hand over $20 million to fund their miserable, fraudulent existence. I instructed my executive assistant to fulfill every single request with absolute and meticulous precision. Give them their sparkling water. Give Thomas his throne. Let them eat their expensive pastries. I agreed to every petty, humiliating demand because I wanted their egos inflated to the absolute breaking point. The higher their pedestals were elevated, the harder the concrete floor would feel when they inevitably plummeted. For 15 years I had shrunk myself to fit into the microscopic box they built for me. I had swallowed their insults, accepted their leftover crumbs, and believed the narrative that I was simply a bad investment. But standing in that boardroom preparing to spring a trap, they could not possibly fathom. The last lingering shadows of that terrified teenager completely vanished. My parents believed they were coming to humiliate me in front of a private audience. I decided to give them an audience they would never, ever forget. The Harvest Root boardroom was uniquely designed for high-level corporate negotiations. It featured a massive soundproof glass wall that separated the main conference area from an adjoining executive observation suite. I walked over to the digital wall console and pressed a small silver button. The heavy frosted privacy tint on the glass immediately cleared, revealing the darkened observation room next door. The previous evening, I had personally contacted the chairman of my board of directors, along with the 4 primary stakeholders, who had been aggressively pushing for my termination over the past 12 days. The 14-day deadline they had imposed on me was suffocating, and they fully expected me to fail. I did not give them the details of my plan. I simply told them that if they wanted to see the undeniable truth behind the $50 million scandal threatening our corporate merger, they needed to be seated in that observation suite at 9:45 in the morning. I promised them a permanent and absolute resolution. I also reached out to Marcus, our lead national distributor, the man who was 24 hours away from pulling his lucrative contracts and destroying our supply chain. I told him to trust me one last time. They had all agreed to attend. They would be sitting in that darkened room, watching and listening to every word spoken at the mahogany table through the integrated audio feed. But corporate stakeholders were merely the civil audience. I needed criminal accountability. I needed the people who stole my identity to face the terrifying weight of the federal justice system. Through David and his extensive forensic network, we had established direct contact with the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When I presented the mountain of undeniable evidence we extracted from my father's safe, the Bureau moved with staggering and relentless speed. I showed them the fraudulent commercial loan applications utilizing my stolen childhood Social Security number. I showed them the explicit federal wire fraud orchestrated by Greg. I showed them the delicate sheet of tracing paper that proved the business contract was a malicious forgery. Because of that evidence, 2 plainclothes federal agents were already stationed inside my building. Agent Reynolds and Agent Pierce were specialists in high-level financial fraud and identity theft. They were calm, sharp, and terrifyingly efficient. I had placed them right inside the observation suite alongside the board members. They were fully briefed, legally authorized, and currently carrying federal arrest warrants hidden inside their unassuming briefcases. They were going to sit quietly behind the soundproof glass, acting as silent witnesses to the greatest performance of Thomas Foster's criminal career. Once the trap was sprung, there would be no civil litigation. There would be no quiet settlements. There would only be handcuffs. I placed my sleek black briefcase on the table right next to the chair I would occupy. Inside sat the exact instruments of their destruction. The original forged contract, the permission slip, the bank routing numbers, and the loan applications. I arranged the heavy designer pens for the settlement signing, placing one right in front of the head seat. I wanted my father to feel the weight of that pen. I wanted him to taste the wealth he thought he had successfully extorted. The wall clock ticked quietly, marking the final minutes before the ambush. The catering staff quickly exited the room, leaving the imported pastries and sparkling water perfectly arranged. I stood alone in the silence, smoothing the cuffs of my tailored navy suit. I took one deep, grounding breath, inhaling the crisp, air-conditioned atmosphere of my sanctuary. My phone vibrated softly on the polished wood. It was a text from the lobby security desk. The Foster party had arrived. I pressed the console button, bringing the heavy frost back to the observation glass, hiding my secret audience in plain sight. I walked over, unlocked the heavy oak doors, and waited for my family to finally step into the abyss. The double glass doors of the main lobby swung open with a heavy mechanical thud. The foul stench of unearned entitlement flooded the pristine reception area of Harvest Root headquarters. My father, Thomas, led the procession, puffing out his chest like a conquering general returning from a glorious and bloody war. Diane marched right beside him, clutching a ridiculously oversized designer handbag, her chin tilted upward so far she was practically staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles. Chelsea trailed slightly behind them, flanked by their sleazy contingency lawyer, Robert Vance. Chelsea was busy adjusting her pristine silk blouse and shooting disdainful, haughty glares at my hardworking reception staff. I watched their entire arrival through the live security feed on my digital tablet. My stomach turned violently as my mother literally snapped her fingers at a junior administrative assistant, demanding directions to the executive suite as if the highly educated young woman were a lowly servant. They did not walk. They strutted. They moved with the aggressive and suffocating confidence of people who completely believed they had successfully bullied the world into absolute submission. I sat perfectly still at the center of the massive mahogany table in the executive boardroom, listening to the heavy rhythmic clicking of their expensive shoes echoing down the long marble hallway. Every single step they took toward the heavy oak double doors felt like a drumbeat of pure delusion. They were ascending to the 42nd floor, riding my private elevator, entirely convinced they were about to tear away half of the logistics empire I had sacrificed my entire youth to construct. For 15 agonizing years, I had carried the suffocating weight of their rejection. I had let their cruel words echo in my mind every time I faced a corporate hurdle. But today, listening to them approach my sanctuary, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical anticipation. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was laid out. All I had to do was let their monumental greed drive them straight over the edge. When the heavy oak doors finally pushed open, the sheer volume of their arrogance seemed to suck all the breathable oxygen right out of the room. Thomas did not even bother to look at me or acknowledge my presence. He bypassed my assigned seat entirely and made a direct, highly calculated beeline for the massive leather chair at the absolute head of the table. He sat down heavily, resting his forearms on the polished wood, claiming the space with a sickeningly triumphant sigh. Diane immediately began inspecting the lavish spread of artisan pastries I had ordered specifically to inflate their egos. She turned up her nose at a beautiful blueberry tart before loudly complaining to Vance that the corporate catering at this company was hopelessly pedestrian. She demanded to know where her specific brand of imported sparkling water was, ignoring the crystal pitcher sitting less than 3 feet from her perfectly manicured hand. Chelsea collapsed into a chair next to her mother, pulling out a gold compact mirror to check her bright red lipstick. She acted utterly bored and profoundly unimpressed by the towering glass sanctuary hovering above the Chicago skyline. They behaved exactly like a tyrannical royal family inspecting a newly acquired, poorly managed province. Vance slapped his battered leather briefcase onto the table with a loud theatrical thwack. He practically salivated as he unbuckled the straps and pulled out the thick stack of settlement documents. He spread the crisp white pages across the wood with trembling hands, his beady eyes gleaming with the predatory thrill of a massive, unearned payday. Those papers represented a clean $20 million extortion. Thomas leaned forward, staring intensely at the bold print detailing the financial transfer. The raw, unfiltered greed burning in his dark eyes was so intense it made my skin crawl. He licked his lips, completely mesmerized by the sheer amount of wealth sitting mere inches from his grasp. Diane stopped complaining about the pastries and scooted her chair closer, her gaze firmly locked onto the final signature line at the bottom of the page. Chelsea finally put her mirror away, leaning in to stare at the zeros printed on the contract. They were entirely blissfully oblivious to the fact that the frosted glass wall directly behind them was hiding the entire board of directors, my lead national distributor, and 2 armed federal agents. They were far too intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance to notice the absolute ringing silence of the room. They felt invincible, wrapped in a blanket of supreme suburban arrogance that blinded them to the reality of their situation. Thomas slowly tore his eyes away from the settlement figure and finally looked directly at me. He adjusted his silk tie, smoothed the lapels of his suit jacket, and puffed out his chest. He was preparing to deliver the ultimate humiliating monologue he had undoubtedly rehearsed in the mirror all morning. He cleared his throat loudly, assuming a tone of sickeningly sweet paternal wisdom. He stated that it was truly a shame things had to get so exceptionally ugly before I finally understood my proper place in the world. He looked around the vast empty chairs of the boardroom, addressing the invisible corporate audience he assumed was cowering under his immense legal threat. He declared with absolute breathtaking delusion that family always comes together. In the very end, no matter how stubborn or rebellious a child might try to be. He continued his patronizing speech, insisting that a real business empire requires the steady, experienced hand of a true patriarch to guide it through the rough waters of the modern economy. He told me he was genuinely glad I had finally learned some proper respect. He claimed that giving up my selfish pride to save my little logistics company was the very first mature decision I had made in 15 years. He actually believed he was the gracious victim accepting my heartfelt apology. He did not show a single ounce of remorse for the immense pain he had caused me. Thomas extended his hand across the table, snapping his fingers in a demanding rhythmic cadence. He ordered me to stop wasting his valuable time and hand over the heavy gold pen sitting near my folder so he could finally sign his name and secure his $20 million check. The heavy gold pen lay perfectly still on the polished mahogany surface. My father kept his hand suspended in the air, his fingers snapping in that rhythmic, degrading cadence he had used to command me when I was a helpless child. He fully expected me to flinch. He expected me to bow my head, pick up that heavy instrument of my own defeat, and place it directly into his greedy, waiting palm. The air in the enormous boardroom was so thick with their toxic entitlement that it felt like trying to breathe underwater. My mother was already leaning forward in her expensive chair, a predatory gleam in her eyes, while my sister tapped her manicured nails impatiently against the edge of the table. Their high-priced lawyer simply smirked, practically calculating his massive contingency fee in his head. But I did not move toward the pen. I did not shrink back into my tailored executive chair. Instead, I let a heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the vast room. I let it stretch until the arrogant, triumphant smirk on Thomas's face began to falter, replaced by a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of deep confusion. Slowly, with absolute and deliberate precision, I pushed my chair back. The heavy leather scraped loudly against the pristine hardwood floor, echoing like a sudden gunshot in the dead, silent room. I stood up to my full height. For the first time in my entire existence, I was not looking up at the people who had terrorized my youth and discarded me like absolute trash. I was finally looking down at them. I walked around the edge of the massive table, my heels clicking with a steady, rhythmic finality that seemed to make my mother physically flinch. I stopped right next to my father's chair. He instinctively pulled his extended hand back, his dark eyes narrowing in sudden, sharp suspicion. I did not reach for the expensive gold pen. I reached for the thick, crisp stack of settlement documents that his sleazy lawyer had so eagerly spread out before us. I gathered the heavy white pages into a neat, uniform pile, tapping the edges gently against the mahogany wood until they were perfectly aligned. My mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp, demanding to know what on earth I was doing. I ignored her entirely. I looked down at Thomas, letting a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. The terrified, discarded 15-year-old girl who used to cry alone in the snow was permanently dead. In her place stood the hardened chief executive officer of Harvest Root, and she was entirely done playing the compliant victim. I held the $20 million extortion agreement lightly in my hands, weighing the paper as if it were completely meaningless. "You just told me that family always comes together in the end," I said, keeping my voice dangerously soft and perfectly even. "You just told this empty room that I owe you a massive, unforgivable debt for the beautiful, privileged life you generously provided me." I paused, letting the cold reality of my words sink into the stifling atmosphere. "But, Thomas, if you truly wanted a return on your investment, you really should have started actually acting like a father 15 years ago." The confusion on his face instantly morphed into an ugly, mottled mask of pure rage. He slammed his closed fist down on the table, the crystal water glasses rattling violently against the wood. He ordered me to sit back down and sign the papers, immediately treating me like a disobedient teenager who had just talked back. I turned my back on him. I walked slowly and purposefully toward the far corner of the executive boardroom. Resting against the towering floor-to-ceiling window was a heavy-duty industrial-grade paper shredder, a machine designed to destroy massive volumes of sensitive corporate data. I reached out and flipped the heavy power switch, The machine hummed to life with a deep, hungry mechanical growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Behind me, I heard a chair scrape violently backward. The lawyer shouted a panicked warning, his voice cracking with sudden terror, but he was far too late. Without breaking eye contact with the reflection of my father in the dark glass wall, I slid the entire stack of legal settlement documents directly into the feeding slot. The powerful steel blades grabbed the thick paper instantly. A loud, violent grinding noise filled the elegant room as the $20 million demand was brutally and systematically ripped into thousands of worthless tiny white ribbons. My mother screamed a shrill, piercing sound of absolute, unadulterated horror that echoed off the glass walls. Chelsea leaped out of her chair, her hands flying to her mouth, as she watched her imaginary luxury lifestyle literally turn into falling confetti. The desperate lawyer scrambled across the long room, violently pushing past my sister, desperately reaching for the machine. But the heavy paper was already gone, instantly devoured by the churning steel teeth. He fell to his knees beside the shredder, staring into the clear plastic bin, filling rapidly with shredded paper, looking as if he had just witnessed a brutal murder. Thomas stood completely frozen at the head of the mahogany table. His face turned an alarming shade of dark purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight silk collar. He was staring at the machine utterly and completely paralyzed, completely, unable to process the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. For weeks, he had orchestrated a brilliant, flawless media campaign to crush my spirit. He had walked into my building expecting to be crowned a king. Instead, the illusion of his absolute control had just been pulverized right in front of his eyes. The $20 million lifeline that was supposed to save him from complete financial ruin was gone. The mechanical grinding slowly faded into a quiet, electric hum. I turned around to face the absolute wreckage of my biological family. They were staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the obedient daughter they thought they had cornered was actually the predator who had just locked the cage. The sound of the heavy-duty paper shredder grinding their $20 million extortion demand into confetti was still ringing in the massive executive boardroom. My father, Thomas, stood completely frozen at the head of the mahogany table. His jaw was practically unhinged. Diane was clutching her designer handbag so tightly, her knuckles were stark white against the leather. Chelsea looked like she had forgotten how to breathe altogether. I did not give them a single second to recover their shattered composure. I reached into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small black remote control. I held it up right in front of my father and his wide, terrified eyes. I told him that shredding his fraudulent settlement was not the conclusion of our meeting today. I told him it was merely the introduction. I pressed the top button on the remote, and the heavy velvet curtains lining the far wall of the boardroom began to slowly and automatically draw shut. The room plunged into a dramatic and heavy dimness. A massive, high-definition projector screen hummed quietly as it lowered from the ceiling right behind where my father was sitting in his chosen throne. I clicked the remote again to power on the laser projector. A blindingly bright image illuminated the screen and filled the darkened room with the absolute, undeniable truth. I had spent hours the previous night working with David to scan and digitally enhance the contents of the red folder we extracted from the wall safe. The first slide displayed a side-by-side comparison of the document they had used to terrorize my company. On the left side of the screen was the highly publicized business contract, falsely claiming Thomas owned 50% of Harvest Road. On the right side was the faded high school permission slip from 15 years ago, bearing my authentic teenage signature. Right in the middle, overlapping both images, was the translucent sheet of tracing paper we had found stapled to the original file. The high-resolution scan highlighted every single pencil indentation and ink bleed. It showed exactly how my father had painstakingly traced my signature to steal my adult livelihood. I walked slowly down the length of the long table, allowing the sheer magnitude of the forgery to wash over them. I told Thomas that I had the original physical documents safely secured in a secondary location far out of his reach. I made sure to speak loudly and clearly, so the board of directors and the federal agents sitting silently behind the frosted glass wall could hear every single syllable. But a forged contract was only half the story. I clicked the remote a third time. The screen shifted from the tracing paper to a chaotic, sprawling spreadsheet bathed in stark, red ink. It was the complete and comprehensive ledger of my parents' absolute financial ruin. I pointed to the bottom line, highlighting the massive $4 million in toxic, unmanageable debt they were desperately hiding from their affluent social circle. I detailed the multiple mortgages on their suburban estate and the predatory private loans with suffocating interest rates. I laid bare their desperate, terrifying motive for trying to extort me. They did not want to run a logistics company. They wanted to pay off dangerous loan sharks before the bank chained the doors of their country club mansion. The reaction from their contingency lawyer was instantaneous and explosive. Robert Vance leaped out of his expensive leather chair as if the mahogany wood had suddenly caught fire. He stared at the giant projector screen with a look of pure, unadulterated panic sweeping across his face. A man who made his living navigating the gray areas of civil litigation recognized a severe federal crime the exact moment it was projected in 40 feet of high-definition light. He realized with terrifying clarity that his clients had actively used him to file a fraudulent lawsuit based on explicitly forged documents. If he stayed in this room for another minute, he knew he would be deeply implicated in a massive criminal conspiracy. Vance did not even bother to pack his briefcase neatly. He wildly swept his remaining legal pads and expensive pens into his bag, leaving a trail of scattered blank papers across the polished table. He practically shouted over the gentle hum of the projector, loudly and frantically declaring that he was formally and immediately recusing himself as their legal counsel. He stated for the record that he had been completely deceived regarding the authenticity of the contract, and that he wanted absolutely nothing to do with their criminal enterprise. Thomas reached out and tried to grab his arm, begging him to stay and fight the allegations, but Vance violently shook him off. The lawyer sprinted for the heavy oak doors, ripping them open, and fleeing down the marble hallway as fast as his legs could carry him. He abandoned his clients entirely, prioritizing his own law license and freedom over their sinking ship. With their legal shield completely vanished, the remaining members of the Foster family instantly turned on each other like starving wolves locked inside a tiny cage. The pristine illusion of their unified, perfect suburban family shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. Diane was the first to completely lose her mind. She scrambled backward in her chair, pointing a violently trembling finger at her golden child. Diane started screaming at the top of her lungs, blaming Chelsea for everything that was currently happening. She shrieked that none of this disaster would have occurred if Chelsea and Greg had not burned through their retirement savings with their pathetic failing real estate flips. Diane wailed that she was going to lose her beautiful home and her prestigious country club membership because she tried to bail out a spoiled, ungrateful daughter who could never budget her own money. Chelsea recoiled as if she had been physically struck across the face. Her perfectly curated socialite mask completely melted away, revealing the vicious, ugly entitlement underneath. She whipped her head around and directed her venom straight at her husband. Chelsea screamed at Greg, demanding to know how I had obtained the highly confidential financial records of their private debt. She accused him of being a weak, incompetent failure who could not even protect his own family from a simple corporate executive. She shrieked that he must have leaked the information because he was too much of a coward to handle the pressure of real business. Greg did not defend himself against the onslaught. He did not yell back or try to calm his hysterical wife. He simply sat there in his tailored navy suit, staring blankly at the floorboards. He looked completely and utterly defeated, fully aware that the wire fraud evidence I held would soon send him away for decades. He kept his eyes glued to his expensive leather shoes, refusing to look at Chelsea or my screaming parents. The beautiful mahogany boardroom was now echoing with the deafening sound of their absolute mutual destruction. They were tearing each other apart right in front of me, doing exactly what they had tried to do to me 15 years ago. I stood quietly near the projector screen, simply watching the spectacular implosion of the people who had once called me worthless. I did not need to raise my voice or throw a single insult. The undeniable truth was already doing all the heavy lifting. The boardroom was vibrating with the toxic aftermath of their panic. My mother was still gasping for thin air, her chest heaving as she glared at my sister. Chelsea was a sobbing, trembling mess, clutching her designer silk blouse, as if the expensive fabric could shield her from the terrifying reality of her ruined life. My father just stood there, a hollow shell of the arrogant tyrant I had feared for 15 painful years. He looked like a man who had suddenly forgotten how to speak, how to move, how to breathe. But I was not finished. The show had one final act, and I intended to make sure they watched every single excruciating second of it. I lifted the small remote control, feeling the smooth black plastic under my thumb, and pressed the top button one last time. The projector clicked loudly, and the image on the massive screen instantly shifted. The glaring red spreadsheet vanished, replaced by stark, high-resolution scans of official bank documents. The room fell dead silent once again. Even my mother stopped her frantic breathing to stare at the glowing wall. Projected in towering, unmissable letters were the heavily stamped logos of a major national commercial bank. Below those corporate logos lay columns of fine print detailing $300,000 in high-risk business loans. I watched my father step backward, his legs suddenly failing to support his weight. He bumped into the heavy mahogany table, gripping the polished edge with white knuckles just to stay upright. His dark eyes were wide, completely locked onto the bottom of the projected pages, where my personal information was typed in bold, undeniable black ink. My full name, my home address, and my stolen childhood social security number. I took a slow, measured step toward him, the sound of my heels cutting through the dense, suffocating atmosphere. I let the absolute gravity of the moment settle over the room before I spoke. I looked directly into his terrified eyes. I told them that stealing my college savings when I was a vulnerable teenager was a despicable moral failure. I explained that extorting me with a fabricated partnership agreement was a pathetic attempt at civil theft. But this I pointed directly at the glaring numbers illuminating the dark room. Forging a civil contract is one thing, I said, keeping my voice chillingly calm and perfectly steady. Committing federal identity theft across state lines to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars is another. The blood completely drained from my father's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse to weave another elaborate lie to save his own skin, but his voice completely abandoned him. He knew exactly what those applications meant. He had deliberately weaponized my pristine credit score to fund his failing suburban illusion, completely convinced I would never find out. He thought he could outsmart the national banking system, just like he thought he could easily outsmart the daughter he had discarded in the snow. My mother finally understood the massive legal weight of what was displayed on that giant screen. She stumbled backward, pressing her shaking hands against her cheeks. Realizing that her husband had not just ruined their finances, he had actively committed a massive federal felony that carried a mandatory prison sentence. I did not give them time to beg. I did not give them the satisfaction of offering a final, tearful plea for mercy. I turned my head slightly toward the frosted glass wall enclosing the observation suite. I gave a single firm nod. The electronic lock on the heavy suite door disengaged with a sharp echoing beep that sliced through the silent boardroom. The heavy glass door swung open, and Special Agent Reynolds and Special Agent Pierce stepped out from the shadows. They did not swagger or shout. They did not need to. They moved with the terrifying clinical efficiency of federal authorities, who had executed this exact maneuver 1,000 times before. They wore dark, unassuming suits, but the silver badges clipped to their belts caught the harsh glare of the projector light shining like beacons of absolute ruin. My father stared at them, completely paralyzed, his brain entirely unable to process that his perfect, carefully curated life was officially over. Agent Reynolds approached Thomas first, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from the back of his belt. He stated his name, his federal agency, and announced in a clear, booming voice that Thomas Foster was under arrest for multiple counts of aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. The sound of the metal ratchets clicking tightly around my father's wrists echoed through the cavernous boardroom like a judge bringing down a heavy wooden gavel. It was the most beautiful, vindicating sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Agent Pierce moved smoothly toward my mother, calmly instructing her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Diane let out a guttural, terrifying shriek. She wildly shook her head, thrashing her shoulders, insisting there was a terrible mistake. She screamed at the top of her lungs that she was a prominent member of the country club community and could not possibly be treated like a common street criminal. The agent simply grabbed her wrists, securing the cold metal cuffs with practiced, undeniable force, as he calmly and systematically read her Miranda rights. The reality of the cold steel finally broke her completely. Chelsea, watching her wealthy, arrogant parents being physically restrained by federal authorities, let out a piercing wail and completely collapsed. Her knees buckled, and she dropped right onto the pristine hardwood floor. She lay there surrounded by the tiny, worthless, shredded ribbons of her ruined $20 million demand, sobbing hysterically into her trembling hands. Greg did not move a single muscle to comfort his wailing wife. He simply stood perfectly still in the far corner of the room, sweating profusely. Staring blankly at the wall, fully realizing that his own inevitable arrest for embezzlement was coming next. I stood tall at the head of the table, breathing in the crisp air of my company, watching the people who threw me away finally face the absolute justice they deserved. The weeks following that explosive morning in the boardroom moved with a breathtaking velocity. For 15 years, my parents had relied on the slow, agonizing crawl of civil disputes and familial manipulation to maintain their power. But the federal justice system operates on an entirely different frequency. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation sinks its teeth into a massive interstate identity theft and wire fraud conspiracy, they do not hesitate, and they certainly do not care about your social standing. The absolute destruction of Thomas and Diane Foster was not just complete, it was remarkably incredibly public. Within 48 hours, the pristine, carefully curated illusion of their perfect suburban existence was violently shattered across every local newspaper and regional business journal. The headlines were merciless. Prominent local businessman and socialite wife indicted in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. The details of their crimes were laid bare for their entire affluent community to read over their morning coffee. The articles detailed how Thomas had maliciously stolen his own daughter's childhood social security number to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent commercial loans. They reported on Diane as a willing and active co-conspirator who helped facilitate the elaborate forgery of my logistics company partnership agreement. My parents were entirely denied bail. The federal judge presiding over their arraignment viewed them as extreme flight risks given the staggering amount of toxic debt they were desperately trying to outrun. They were transported directly from the courthouse to a federal holding facility. Thomas, who had marched into my office demanding a $20 million extortion check, was now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit sharing a tiny concrete cell with strangers. Diane, who had complained about the quality of my imported sparkling water, was eating institutional food on a metal tray. They were both facing mandatory federal prison sentences that would likely span the entire remainder of their natural lives. The financial fallout was swift and utterly catastrophic. The moment the federal indictment was officially unsealed, the national banks moved in like starving vultures. Every single one of their accounts was immediately frozen. The massive rolling suburban estate they had used as a grand monument to their fake superiority was instantly seized. I drove past their neighborhood exactly 1 month after the boardroom ambush. The perfectly manicured lawn was already beginning to look slightly overgrown, but the most striking detail was the bright neon foreclosure notice aggressively stapled directly to the center of their custom mahogany front door. The physical manifestation of their massive, unmanageable debt was finally on full display for every judgmental neighbor to see. But perhaps the most devastating blow to my parents' fragile egos was their absolute social excommunication. Thomas and Diane had spent decades cultivating a pristine reputation at their elite ultra-conservative church. They had used their front row pew as a stage to judge everyone else around them. When the news of their federal indictment broke, that same church community completely and ruthlessly abandoned them. There were no prayer circles organized on their behalf. There were no sympathetic phone calls or supportive visits. The church board held an emergency closed-door meeting and formally excommunicated them, citing severe moral turpitude. The country club immediately revoked their membership. The people they had spent their entire lives trying to impress completely erased them from memory, as if they had never existed at all. While my parents sat in federal custody awaiting a trial they could never win. My sister Chelsea was experiencing her own spectacular unraveling. For her entire adult life, she had been completely insulated from the consequences of her actions. She had used my parents as an endless financial safety net, allowing them to bleed me dry to fund her fake luxury lifestyle. But with Thomas and Diane legally paralyzed, and their bank accounts seized, the safety net entirely vanished. And the federal agents investigating my father's finances had not simply stopped at the fraudulent business loans. The forensic audit naturally led them straight to Greg and his chaotic, failing real estate ventures. The agents quickly discovered the massive escrow fraud he had been committing to keep his drowning properties afloat. 2 days after my parents were arrested, federal authorities raided Greg's downtown office. They seized his computers, confiscated his filing cabinets, and Frog marched him out of the building in handcuffs right in front of his shocked employees. Facing insurmountable legal fees and absolutely staggering federal fines, Greg immediately filed for total bankruptcy. His career was permanently destroyed, and his freedom was hanging by a single, microscopic thread. Chelsea was left entirely alone to face the brutal, unforgiving reality of the real world. The bank swiftly foreclosed on their lavish, overpriced townhouse, leaving her with absolutely nothing. Her expensive designer wardrobe and imported handbags were liquidated in a desperate attempt to secure a defense attorney for her husband. The golden child who had once mocked my work ethic and sneered at my receptionist was suddenly forced to pack her remaining belongings into garbage bags. She moved into a cramped, dingy, low-income apartment complex on the far outskirts of the city because she possessed absolutely zero marketable skills and a resume consisting entirely of fake vanity projects. Chelsea had to do something she had never done in her entire life. She had to find a real job. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned that she was eventually hired at a massive discount retail chain. The woman who had collapsed in hysterics over losing a $20 million settlement was now forced to wear a stiff polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. She spends 40 hours a week standing on her feet dealing with impatient customers and scanning barcodes just to afford her basic utilities. She has no maids, no luxury vacations, and absolutely no enablers left to save her. She is finally living the exact life she actually earned. I did not attend their preliminary hearings, and I did not drive past Chelsea's miserable new apartment to gloat. I simply stayed in my beautiful high-rise office, steering my logistics empire toward the future. The deep, suffocating poison they had pumped into my veins for 15 years had finally been drawn out. The scales of justice had violently slammed into place, leaving me with a profound, enduring sense of absolute peace. The heavy glass door of the observation suite slowly clicked open, but no one immediately stepped out. For several long minutes, the only sound left in the executive boardroom was the quiet, steady hum of the paper shredder cooling down in the corner. When my board of directors finally emerged from their hidden viewing room, they looked as though they had just witnessed a violent natural disaster. These were seasoned, wealthy corporate titans who casually traded millions of dollars before their morning coffee people, who prided themselves on being ruthless and unflappable. Yet as they walked past the empty leather chairs where my parents had just been handcuffed and hauled away by federal agents, their faces were pale. Their eyes were wide and filled with a profound emotion. It was absolute, undeniable terror. Just 24 hours ago, these same stakeholders had cornered me in this very building. They had handed me a rigid 14-day ultimatum, threatening to strip me of my title if I did not instantly resolve the media circus. They had viewed me as a liability. They had considered my youth as a weakness, assuming I would simply cave under the immense pressure of a public extortion plot. But watching me systematically dismantle my biological family, seeing the cold precision with which I trapped my father into a federal indictment, shattered every misconception they held about my character. They finally understood that I was not just a competent manager. I was a predator who had just learned how to successfully hunt. The emergency board meeting was called to order at 8 a.m. the following day. I walked into the room wearing a tailored gray suit, carrying nothing but a simple cup of black coffee. The atmosphere had entirely transformed. There were no hostile glares or hushed conspiratorial whispers. As I took my seat at the head of the mahogany table, every single board member sat perfectly upright, offering me an unprecedented level of silent deference. The chairman, a stubborn man who had been my loudest critic just 2 weeks prior, nervously cleared his throat. He did not issue any new demands. Instead, he stood up, looked me directly in the eye, and issued a formal, unreserved apology. He acknowledged that the board had deeply misjudged the situation, and drastically misjudged me. He admitted that their lack of faith during the crisis was a massive organizational failure. The entire table murmured in agreement, their collective anxiety practically vibrating through the polished wood. They were completely terrified that I was going to walk away. They knew that if a woman who could coldly hand her own parents over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation decided to launch a competing logistics firm, she would systematically run Harvest Root into the ground within 6 months. I held all the leverage, and I did not even have to point it out. My ruthless execution had done all the talking for me. To guarantee my loyalty and ensure my permanent position at the helm, the board offered a staggering concession. They drafted an immediate resolution restructuring the corporate bylaws, granting me absolute, unassailable voting control over Harvest Route. I would no longer have to fight for approval on major operational shifts or defend my executive decisions against petty boardroom politics. They willingly handed me the ultimate keys to the kingdom, surrendering their authority in exchange for the safety of my continued leadership. I accepted their apology, with a calm nod signed the new resolution, and immediately shifted the conversation back to our supply chain. With the threat of my parents neutralized and my internal power fully solidified, the impending $50 million grocery merger proceeded with breathtaking speed. Marcus, my lead national distributor, had watched the entire federal ambush from the observation suite. The very next day, he personally called me to permanently lock in our long-term distribution contracts. He told me he wanted to be in business with a woman who played chess, while everyone else was busy playing checkers. The massive merger closed seamlessly 3 weeks later, transforming Harvest Route into an absolute titan of the regional logistics industry. The media narrative shifted virtually overnight. The sensationalized stories about a bitter family feud were instantly replaced by glowing profiles in major financial publications. I was hailed as a brilliant, uncompromising chief executive who had single-handedly uncovered a massive federal fraud scheme. My reputation in the corporate world became instantly legendary. Competitors quickly learned that challenging my company was a fundamentally terrible idea. The industry recognized that the woman running Harvest Route possessed boundaries made of solid titanium and a spine forged from pure steel. I had spent the first 15 years of my adult life quietly believing the horrible things my parents had told me about myself. But sitting in my high-rise office watching my company thrive beyond my wildest dreams, I finally realized that my greatest strength was born from their ultimate betrayal. They had forced me to learn how to survive entirely on my own. If you are listening to this story, and you have ever felt completely broken by the people who were supposed to love you the most, I want you to know that you are not a bad investment. You do not owe your success, your peace, or your wealth to toxic family members who only see you as a resource to exploit. Boundaries are not cruel. They are necessary for your survival. Do not ever be afraid to protect the beautiful life you have built. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below letting me know what city and state you are watching from today. Your support truly means the world to me. Always remember to know your exact worth and never let anyone convince you to accept anything less. The afternoon sun casts a long, brilliant golden glow across the polished oak floors of my newly expanded executive suite. I stand completely alone by the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, gazing down at the sprawling, bustling grid of Chicago. Far below me, the logistics trucks bearing the Harvest Route logo look like tiny, white rectangles weaving seamlessly through the concrete arteries of the city. It is remarkably quiet up here on the 42nd floor. The frantic, desperate noise of my past, the screaming, the manipulations, the endless suburban gaslighting has completely and permanently evaporated. For 15 exhausting, agonizing years, I functioned on a single driving philosophy. I honestly believed that massive, undeniable success would be my ultimate revenge against the parents who coldly discarded me in the freezing snow. I poured every single ounce of my youthful energy into building an impenetrable fortress of wealth and corporate power. I sacrificed personal relationships, healthy sleep schedules, and simple daily comforts under the absolute delusion that a multi-million-dollar net worth would somehow act as a permanent shield against Thomas and Diane Foster. I thought that if I climbed high enough up the corporate ladder, their toxic reach could never possibly drag me back down into their miserable, chaotic reality. But the terrifying events of the past few months shattered that naive childhood illusion into a million jagged pieces. I learned the incredibly hard way that financial success does not repel toxic parasites. It actually attracts them with a magnetic force. A high net worth simply painted a giant glowing target on my back. My parents did not look at my profound achievements and feel a sudden surge of remorse or genuine parental pride. They looked at my life's work and saw a very convenient, heavily funded bank account waiting to be aggressively drained to cover their own catastrophic financial failures. They saw my spotless credit score as a tool for their own illegal salvation. That is when the true, deepest lesson finally crystallized in my mind. Success alone is never enough to protect you from people who feel fundamentally entitled to your soul. The only thing that guarantees your lasting peace is the establishment of absolute ironclad boundaries. You must possess the unshakable, unwavering willingness to defend your life, even if it means legally destroying the toxic people who happen to share your last name. Society constantly pushes a deeply flawed and damaging narrative down our throats. We are heavily conditioned to forgive horrible abuses simply because the perpetrators hold the biological title of mother or father. We are told to keep the peace, to swallow our trauma, and to compromise our own safety for the sake of an imaginary family unity. I am here to tell you that biological connection is not a license for extortion. It is not a free pass to steal your identity, forge your signature, and actively attempt to bankrupt your future. Standing up to that kind of profound abuse is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of supreme self-preservation. As I watch the evening shadows slowly lengthen across the downtown skyscrapers, I realize something truly profound. I am no longer angry. The boiling, white-hot rage that fueled my long, sleepless nights and sustained my relentless legal counterattack has entirely burned away. What remains in its place is a deep, clean, and permanent relief. It feels exactly like the distinct physical lightness you experience right after taking several heavy bags of rotting garbage out of your home. The house suddenly smells better. The air is infinitely easier to breathe. The oppressive, suffocating weight of their massive entitlement is officially gone from my shoulders, and it is never coming back to haunt me again. I turn away from the darkening glass and look back at my pristine, quiet office. I think about David, my brilliant forensic accountant who stood by me in the darkest hours of my corporate career. I think about Victoria, who executed my high-stakes legal strategy with flawless, devastating precision. I think about Marcus and the loyal board members who ultimately trusted my bold vision when everything was on the line. These incredible individuals are my actual family. I have learned through a trial by fire that true family has absolutely nothing to do with shared DNA or matching physical features. Real family is built entirely on a solid foundation of mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and genuine support. Family consists of the people who show up to help you build your empire brick by brick, not the ones who show up 15 years later holding a forged contract to steal it away from you. I spent my entire childhood desperately trying to earn the love of hollow, empty people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. Now I am surrounded by remarkable individuals who deeply value my strength and fiercely respect my boundaries. If you are watching this video right now and you are carrying the heavy, agonizing burden of a toxic family member, I want you to know that you are allowed to walk away. You have the absolute, undeniable right to protect the beautiful, peaceful life you have built for yourself. Setting a strict boundary does not make you a bad person. It makes you a strong survivor. Do not ever let anyone manipulate you into accepting abuse under the guise of family loyalty. Thank you so deeply for following my long journey to the very end. If my story resonated with your own experiences, please take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to grow this wonderful community. I would also love to hear from you in the comments section below. Let me know exactly what city and state you are watching from today, and what time it is there right now. Always remember that your peace is worth protecting at all costs, and you are always entirely enough. I want to take a moment to step back from the intense corporate boardrooms and the heavy legal documents to talk directly to you. When I first decided to share this incredibly personal chapter of my life, I hesitated for a long time. Exposing the deepest and darkest flaws of your own family to the entire world is never an easy choice. Society constantly tells us to keep our dirty laundry hidden securely behind closed doors, to protect the family name at all absolute costs, and to simply smile through the agonizing pain during every holiday dinner. But I eventually realized that staying perfectly silent is exactly how manipulative people like Thomas and Diane Foster maintain their suffocating power. They rely entirely on our shame. They count on our deeply ingrained desire to be good daughters, good sons, and accommodating partners. They deliberately weaponize our empathy and use it as a highly effective tool for their own endless financial extraction. I am sharing my survival story today because I know with absolute certainty that I am not the only person who has ever been forced to look across a dining room table and realize the people sitting there do not view them as family at all, but rather as an incredibly convenient bank account. Many of you watching this right now have spent years, perhaps even decades, pouring your heart, your physical energy, and your hard-earned resources into a bottomless pit of familial expectation. You have sacrificed your own peace of mind to keep a fragile peace in a home that never truly felt safe or supportive. For a very long time, I bought into the highly destructive narrative that blood absolutely dictates unconditional loyalty. I honestly thought that because my parents brought me into this world, I was forever indebted to their changing whims, no matter how cruel or financially calculating they became over the years. This is a dangerous lie we are taught from early childhood. It is a massive collective delusion that allows toxic people to operate for decades without ever facing any real consequences. You might be watching this video after spending 30 or 40 years trying to appease a parent, a demanding sibling, or a selfish relative who constantly moves the goalposts of their affection. You might be utterly exhausted from playing a rigged game where the rules are designed specifically for you to lose. Let my painful experience be the ultimate proof that you do not have to play that game for a single second longer. You have the fundamental right to step off the board entirely and take your valuable pieces with you. The exact moment I stopped viewing my parents as infallible authority figures and started seeing them as desperately flawed adults who were actively attempting to ruin my future, everything in my universe shifted. The heavy guilt completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a profound and crystal-clear instinct for survival. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that made you sick, and you certainly cannot build a stable financial future for your retirement if you are constantly handing over your bricks to people who only want to smash your windows. If you have a family member who demands your loyalty but constantly exploits your hard work, stop waiting for them to change. They are never going to wake up one morning and suddenly respect your boundaries. They will never organically realize the immense damage they are causing because your silent pain is the very currency that funds their comfortable existence. You cannot negotiate with a parasite. You have to cut off the supply entirely. Build your walls high, and if they try to break them down, make sure you own the ground they are standing on. You must be entirely prepared to defend your territory with every single legal and financial tool at your disposal. There is no nobility in letting yourself be destroyed by the people who happen to share your last name. Protecting yourself and your hard-earned assets is the ultimate act of self-respect. It takes an immense amount of courage to finally draw a firm line in the sand and tell your own flesh and blood that they no longer have open access to your life. It can feel incredibly lonely and terrifying at first. The initial fallout is always chaotic, filled with screaming matches, flying accusations, and desperate attempts to paint you as the villain of the story to anyone who will listen. Let them talk. Let them spin whatever wild narrative they need to soothe their own bruised egos. Their hollow words hold absolutely no power over your daily reality once you make the firm decision to stop listening to them. The profound silence that eventually follows the storm is worth every single ounce of the struggle. That beautiful, unbroken silence is where you finally get to discover who you actually are, without the suffocating weight of their selfish demands pressing down on your chest. You get to wake up in the morning and know that every dollar you earn, every success you achieve, and every joyful moment you experience belongs entirely to you. You are no longer managing a constant family crisis. You are finally simply living your life. I know that sharing this personal journey might bring up some incredibly difficult and painful memories for many of you today. It is never an easy thing to confront the harsh reality of family betrayal. Have you ever had to legally or financially protect yourself from your own flesh and blood? Drop your story in the comments below. I read through these comments daily, and I am constantly amazed by the incredible resilience and strength of this community. Sharing your truth takes away the power of the people who hurt you, and it helps others realize they are not fighting this difficult battle alone. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Until next time, guard your peace and guard your life.